welcome back. It's another episode of the Wobcast 2.0. It's Mike Wobschall, joining you. Today we focus on the Minnesota Vikings safety room as we continue to go position by position through the Vikings roster early in the offseason, trying to set the table for 2023. We've really gone through a lot of the positions so far: quarterback, running back, receiver, O-line, D-line, tight ends, linebackers. We're working our way now to the secondary. Talking safeties today. We'll get to the specialists as well. Lots of other stuff to talk about on the show, in addition to the position by position preview focusing on the safeties. We're going to talk a little bit of draft, and then I have a couple of things that are kind of on my mind that I want to talk through before we get into the meat of the show. But before we do any and all of that, let's welcome back the usual suspects. It's Gyles and Chase. Hey fellas, how we doing?
Hey, we're doing so well. I mean, we're 23 days away from the draft, and I'm excited beyond belief because I think there's a lot of different options that we can go tackle here in the next 20 days. And I'm even more excited to talk through the safety position today, because when you chat through Brian Flores defense, safety is one of the most important positions.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the impetus behind the title of this episode of the Wobcast, the Vikings' biggest secret weapon in 2023, we think is subject matter for today's show as we talk about safety. So excited to get into that. Both Gyles and I and Chase will have some opinions related to the safety position, to Harrison Smith, to Brian Flores. So a very meaty topic as we continue to take a look at the Vikings defense. How you doing, Chase?
I'm wonderful. I feel like we're kind of approaching that really fun home stretch of not home stretch, but that fun stretch of the offseason with the draft coming up and, some of these signings starting to heat up. So it's a really fun time to be a Vikings fan right now.
I agree with that. So I want to get a couple of things off my mind and bounce some of the thoughts and opinions off of you guys as well before we do get into the meat of the show. And actually, the first one is related to the draft. Thought it was a curious headline, and you guys may have seen it as well, that Jalen Carter is only going to visit teams picking in the top 10. I thought this was a weird headline, and it comes from his agent, Drew Rosenhaus. Remember the backstory on Jalen Carter being involved in the tragic car accident with a couple of other young folks at the University of Georgia. And that all sort of went down right after the national championship game. And then there were some headlines related to it during the combine when Carter was there. So you have that as sort of the tragic backdrop, but he's a really well-regarded prospect. And really he's a top 10 pick in this draft. But I think this headline was just one of those that immediately struck me as curious, Gyles. It's like, and it's Drew Rosenhaus. So I know he's kind of a lightning rod figure in the NFL community, but he's a sophisticated guy who knows what he's doing. And so almost nothing is done at a whim when you're at Drew Rosenhaus's level and you're talking about one of the better players in the draft. So I think we're dealing with some sophistication here behind this headline and behind him saying that. I'm wondering if Drew is running into a situation where a number of teams in the top 10 are uncomfortable with him because of the incident that happened right after the national championship game. And they're saying, you know what, we got this guy as one of our top 10 players, but we're just a little uncomfortable. And I'm wondering if Drew Rosenhaus is so fed up with hearing that he's trying to drum up trade interest and drum up that interest pre-draft so to ease, to assure his client that he'll be going top 10. That's the only thing I can think of, because why would you limit who you're going to have your client go and see? Because a team might be interested in him that's not in the top 10, but you let them visit with your client and they might be really interested and want to make that trade. So that just struck me as very curious when I saw that.
I could not agree more. I mean, it seems like he's been potentially approached by some teams, let's say like the Steelers or some team that may be in the market to try to go grab a defensive lineman. And that's his way of trying to drive up his valuation to say, hey, I'm only going to talk to top 10 people, which means you need to trade up for me. I'm not willing to chat You go do that. All right, we'll dance. We'll go to the prom. But you need to trade up and you need to show your cards first, so to speak, which feels a little bit like a gamble. I mean, I get about trying to drive up your valuation, but feels like a high gamble. Maybe exposes a little bit of immaturity, in my opinion, which may backfire on him, but I guess we'll see. Time will tell.
Yep, time will tell. And the theory that we just sort of discussed might be 100% wrong, and there might be a different motivation behind it. So I am, and we are suggesting a reason behind that headline. It's merely that, a suggestion. The reality might be something completely different or related. I'm not sure, but just one of those headlines that I'm like, that's an unusual headline. And usually where there's smoke, there's fire. That's definitely a smoky headline. All right, second thing. And this is partially emerging or on my mind from the owners' meetings a couple of weeks ago. But it also stems from something that happened in the NFC Championship game with the 49ers and the Eagles. It's related to that as well. And it has to do with roster sizes and the emergency quarterback rule. And if you remember, the Niners basically ran out of quarterbacks in that game, right? And they were having Christian McCaffrey take snaps. And I just think the time has come, because of some other changes that have happened to roster sizes. The time's come, I think, to permanently solve the emergency quarterback situation, but also the game day roster size thing, which has always been a little different. And there's a good reason as to why it happens, but I think it's time for it to change. So we have two things to sort of hit on here. The emergency quarterback rule, which is simpler, and the more complex one of the roster size. So in the old days, it's 53-man roster that gets reduced to 46 players on game day, right? So you have to declare 7 players as inactive on game day. And the reason for that was to balance or level the playing field for a team that might have a lot of injuries. So you're not going into a game with 47 players and your opponent's going into it 53. Everyone's going to go in with 46.
Yep.
But what happened during COVID, if you remember, was because of the protocol being as stringent as it was, they increased roster sizes and they increased practice squad sizes. And so I think now you can have a 53-man roster and have all of them be active on game day, which would allow teams to have a third quarterback active without worrying about wasting a spot. And the reason you can do that now and you couldn't before is because practice squads now are 16 players and you can have vested veterans on your practice squad.
Exactly. Which is a huge adjustment.
Yeah, it is. And so I think we're to the point now where we can almost do away with the inactives on game days and everyone on your team can play, because if you got 4 or 5 injuries and the other team only has 0 or 1 or 2, you're not at such a disadvantage anymore because your practice squad is bigger. It has veteran players on it, and you can pull one of those guys the week of a game, the day before a game, and feel a lot better than you would have felt in the old days. So want your reactions to that. And the second thing is the old emergency quarterback rule was you can have a third quarterback active and he can play if the first 2 quarterbacks are ruled out, then that third one can play. But that third one cannot play until those first 2 are ruled out, / if you put that third one in, those other 2 can't play again. So I just like to get to a situation where we're not in a playoff game and we've run out of quarterbacks because of some roster limit that is an antiquated rule. You know what I mean?
Yep. Especially in the 49ers game, I think there's a pretty high chance that Garoppolo could have stepped in and actually played. Maybe he wasn't a full 100%, obviously not enough to be dressed on game day based on the number of people available to be put on the field. But when you break it down, the NFL is a business. Although, I mean, it's a game and they're wanting to produce a great game. It is a business. And at the end of the day, when you have a game being played without a quarterback, your viewership is going to go askew, where the 49ers didn't have any chance at winning that game after their quarterbacks went down. And if you actually want to present a real competition and cater to both of those fan bases and give you an equal fair shot at going after a Super Bowl, I think it's important for them to adjust the rules. So then, like you mentioned before, we never enter a playoff game where a technicality is preventing them from going ahead to go get a ring.
Exactly. And you said it, it's a business. And I know that increasing roster sizes and making more guys eligible on game day, it's going to cost, because now you have to pay game day salary / wages for more players. But we're talking about a league that's got a team in the Commanders that's going to sell for between $6 and $7 billion. The commissioner last year, I believe, made $63 million. I think we can afford to increase game day roster sizes, by 5 or 6 players. I really think we can. We just added another game last year, so we got a whole nother games, a weekly gate. So
I truly think the cap is going to go up to 300 million within the very short term.
Yeah. So I think the league's in a position where it's going to benefit from increasing roster sizes. I don't think you're jeopardizing competitive integrity. And in fact, I think by doing so, you're increasing player health and safety too. So it's something that I hope they increase game day roster sizes. Last one, full-time officials. How about making these officials full-time? I think it's going to improve the product. I think it's going to enhance player safety, because you're going to have a better enforcement, a more accurate enforcement of the rules, and the rules of the game promote not just integrity and competitiveness, but also promote safety. Again, the money is there, I think, to do this. And I think it's just going to reduce, it's going to add accountability, and it's going to reduce errors, I think. And it's one of those situations, I think, guys, where once the league does it, and I think we are going there, it's just a matter of time. Once the league does it, and then a certain amount of time goes by, we will look back and say, they weren't doing that. They weren't doing this. Like, what? You know what I mean?
Yep. I completely agree. I think it'll be like smoking indoors. Like, that actually happened before.
Yeah.
100%. I think you're going to be able to increase your level of play 100% and actually have a consistent game, and ultimately keep the perceived level of fairness where it needs to be when it comes to the fan bases. Because when you talk to NFL fans that go deep in the playoffs for their team's perspective, usually the number one thing that gets brought up is, oh, well, we got screwed on this piece. And, they talk about the officiating versus the game itself. And I think it's important to bring things back to the root and actually bring conversations and the overall focus of the NFL to the actual play itself and the productivity on the field.
Yep. And, I think when you do this, really regular season games are September to, and then in the playoffs to January, and that first weekend in February. But you got preseason, right? So really it's August. Games are halfway through August through the early part of February, but you'd have them there at training camp. Training camps start at the end of July. So now you're talking about the end of July through the beginning of February, which is really half a year. But I think you would put these guys in, a training and a rules education program throughout the off season. And I think there'd be a physical training component to it as well, where you'd essentially be paying them to be physically fit, to go through a regimen that maybe just like players would go through, not that same intensity and the same amount of weight and all that, but a similar structure. So I really think you can justify the time. The full time, the actual time on task that would be spent year round. Maybe give them a month vacation, or make it a 3-week month during the off season and give them 1 week off every month. So I think you can make it make sense. I think you can make the money make sense, the time makes sense, and I think it results in a better product. So one thing I'd really like to see the league move to, and they talk about a lot of big grand ideas, guys. They talk about having a team internationally, housed in London or Germany. They talk about having a division over there. They talk about permanent flexes of Thursday night games, all these big grand ideas, which are fine. But how about some of these more practical ones, like increasing roster sizes and having full-time officials? These are maybe not as sexy, and maybe you see the cost of them, but they will improve the product. And the one thing that's always been great about the NFL is it's been king of the American sports landscape for 20 years. And they've never just rested on their laurels. They're always experimenting and trying things. And sometimes it fails, but sometimes it works. And these are two things that I think it's time to implement that. So hopeful that they do that. There'll be another owners meeting coming up in May. I don't expect that either of those two things I just mentioned will be ratified and pass, but I hope there's more discussion about it. So just a few things on my mind before we get to the meat and potatoes of this episode of the Wobcast, which is the Vikings' best secret weapon in 2023. We're ready to talk safeties and your Minnesota Vikings. I will let me set the table a little bit here, Gyles, and then let you sort of take it from there. I think the way we look at the safety position, I think you start with Harrison Smith, who coming into the offseason, I think it was questionable whether he would be back or not. Fair to say?
Yep.
Now I think it's fair to say he's going to be here. So really the question is, who's next to him when the season starts? And of those who are not lining up as the starter next to them, how is that playing time going to be divvied out? How exactly is Brian Flores going to deploy the safety position within his scheme? And then how does Harrison Smith execute that? And then how does the second starter execute that? So before we get into maybe some of your big picture ideas, Gyles, and maybe some of the PFF data, let's go through Lewis Cine, Cam Bynum, and Josh Metellus. Those are the top three candidates to start next to Harrison Smith, right?
Agreed. Because I don't think Miles Dorn has got a shot in that category, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. All right. So Lewis Cine, recovering from injury, the highest ceiling of the group, position versatility. Agreed? Okay.
Yep. Also, tremendous speed. Probably the fastest person on the team.
Okay. So if speed is a theory, or if speed is a predominant trait that you would want in a Brian Flores defense, advantage Cine.
Correct.
Okay. Cam Bynum, some experience playing last year. I would say, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of Cam Bynum, you still would have to agree that he's at an ascending stage in his career arc.
Agreed.
What rate he's ascending at is up for debate, but he is ascending.
Yep.
However, I think he is ripe for the picking, to be picked off and to be surpassed by someone else.
Agreed.
All fair? Okay.
Yeah. When you look at Cam Bynum, he is probably the best run defender on the team. He's the best tackler on the team, at least from the safety position. But unfortunately, from a pass rush standpoint and a coverage standpoint, he's the worst safety on the team. So he has some pretty big strengths, but some pretty poor weaknesses.
Okay. And then lastly, Josh Metellus. Data may suggest, in fact, we've already discussed in previous episodes, the data does suggest the defense would have performed better had Metellus played more and others played less. And then the last sort of part of the evaluation of Metellus before I turn it over to you, Gyles, is Metellus has one of my favorite sort of pedigrees or profiles for a complimentary starter. He came up through special teams. Andrew Sendejo, Hussein Abdullah, guys who sort of Jamarcus Sanford back in the day, cut their teeth on special teams, ascended to a starting role. I love that pedigree as a complimentary starter at corner or safety. So that's what I really like about Josh Metellus. So that's sort of how I see it from a high level. The safety room, curious to know some of your thoughts on that or anything else.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're absolutely correct in the fact that Harrison Smith will be a day one starter. I don't think anyone's debating that. Although he had a down year in 2022, he had a 68.4 grade. He was elite in tackling. He was very above average in coverage, but he struggled in pass rush, which brought down his grade, and was a little bit suspect in run defense. He ended the year at a 64 grade. Not horrible, but not great. And I truly think the schematics that Brian Flores brings to the table will bring Harrison Smith back to true elite all pro format and posture, so to speak, because really when I look at the numbers that kind of contribute to each of these grades, he didn't really drop off. He just didn't pass rush very much. He had 14 pass rush snaps in 2022. And we had a whole number of other issues when it came to pass rushing. especially when you look at the coverage in comparison to pass rush. So I really don't see him as a deteriorating player considering his age or his cap hit. I think he can really get back to an all-pro level or at least a Pro Bowl level at bare minimum. So I'm really excited to see his contributions back on the field under Brian Flores. So like you mentioned, who's going to be the opposite of Harrison Smith? And I think this is where you really have to start playing chess when it comes to what do you do in 2023 and how does that relate into 2024? Because I believe Harrison Smith is under contract for one more year based on how they redid their contract. So I think who you put opposite will be not only the starter 2022 or 2023, but also in 2024. You need to decide, all right, who's going to replace Harrison Smith come Harrison Smith's departure in 2024. And when you look at it, Josh Metellus, he ended the year at an 85.1 grade. Now, some people might say, well, he didn't play very much. Well, when you look at PFF specifically, they have a filter when it comes to all their different players, and they have a filter for minimum snaps. And the standard filter is 20% of snaps. Did you play under or over 20% of snaps? It just so happens that Josh Metellus played literally one snap less than 20% of snaps for all qualified safeties.
No way.
If we're willing to give him one extra snap just for the sake of conversation, to say he played 20% of snaps, guess where he ranked among all qualified safeties?
Yeah, I'm going to guess pretty high here. I'm going to guess pretty high. I'm going to guess 19th.
Higher.
Wow. 12th.
Higher.
7th.
Higher.
2nd.
He was literally the third best safety in the league. Now, obviously, he didn't play all snaps like Cameron Bynum did, but he at least played 20% of snaps minus one. When it came to coverage, he was the 10th best safety. This guy is doing some really incredible things. Once again, he ended the year at an 85.1 grade across the board. He was elite in tackling, elite in pass rush, elite in coverage. The only area that he was a less than essentially an 80 was in run defense, and he was still a 72.5. Like, this guy was doing phenomenal things. Plus, I don't think it should go unnoticed, he was elected as a team captain, which means he's also great behind the scenes. He's great on the field and off the field. So I'm really excited about Josh Metellus. So we'll get back to that in a second, but I think it's important to call out Josh Metellus's performance. Now, when you kind of filter that over to Cam Bynum, he was the other category where he ended the year at a 58.7 grade. Did pretty good in run defense, pretty good in tackling. I would say he was more in the elite category, but he was entering dumpster fire category from a pass rush standpoint and a coverage standpoint. Now, that's obviously the downside. Wasn't good in coverage, which unfortunately is a big piece of being the safety. Wasn't good in pass rush, which is another important piece of being a safety. He was durable. He did play every single snap for the Minnesota Vikings in 2022. Literally every snap he was on the field. So he's a very durable player, which I don't think should go unnoticed.
No,
but if
not at all.
Yeah, exactly. And if I think I'm really being objective here, that is a great backup to have in a safety where you have someone that is very durable. He's always going to be available, just not necessarily someone that I would love to start if you do have Josh Metellus on the roster. So if I'm having to pick someone that's on the opposite of Harrison Smith, I am moving forward with Josh Metellus. I do believe he's earned that both on and off the field. He's got enough of a track record. The guys love him. Put Josh Metellus on the field and let's go attack the safety position. And honestly, if you're being a little bit speculative and maybe a little bit homerish, I don't think it's unreasonable to say you could have a top 10 safety room if both of these guys truly reach their elite form. But that obviously tackles 2023 if you enter the season with Josh Metellus and Harrison Smith. But then that kind of brings up the conversation about 2024. If Harrison Smith is not on the field, then do you bring in Lewis Cine? And that's where Lewis Cine is a little bit of a question mark to me, because going into the season, I was very high on Lewis Cine. If you kind of look at tape from his days at Georgia, he was an elite safety. He was playing things at a really great format. However, he wasn't playing in a 3-4 defense. So it's a little bit of an adjustment. But he was so fast. I believe he actually had the fastest 10 split time out of any safety in history. Like, this guy is lightning speed fast, which is something that is really valuable to have in a safety. So I'm wondering if they'll let him sit or maybe even let him filter in a little bit throughout the year. But I think your starting safeties will be Josh Metellus and Harrison Smith. Lewis Cine might filter in a little bit, and then Lewis Cine taking over for the starting position for Harrison Smith in 2024.
Yep. I like how you laid that out. Now, what I see materializing here at the safety position, Gyles, I see a general advantage as I'm going to make a point here that is applicable to Brian Flores joining the Vikings, but is specifically applicable to the safety position. So generally, it's an advantage the Vikings have this year is that Brian Flores is new to the Vikings. And so he's going to come in with fresh ideas. Some will work, some will not work. Some the opponent will be able to anticipate because Brian Flores has a track record. Some the opponent will not be able to anticipate because it's his first time working with Harrison Smith and it's his first time working with Byron Murphy or whoever. So,
yeah.
But specific to the safety position, would you rather have, a stud like Harrison Smith and a stud like Derwin James paired up at safety? Yeah, of course, that would be the best. But you don't have that. Most teams don't have that. So if instead of that, what you have is maybe not a no doubt about it, 100 snaps out of a game or out of the season guy, but you have a safety by committee thing here going on. That's good. But what makes that great is if members of the committee each do something different really well, so that because it's like when Lamar Jackson isn't the quarterback and Tyler Huntley is, it's like the offense isn't changing. They're doing the same stuff. It's just they're not going to do it as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But like if Lamar Jackson's your quarterback and then, Matt Ryan's your backup, like the whole thing's different. I mean, so like you have to prepare for that team much differently than you have to prepare for the team that's just got the same guy as the backup. He's just not as good. So if Brian Flores can get a really good inventory of what Scene can do really well, what Smith can do really well, what Metellus can do, what Bynum can do, and he's mixing and matching based on personnel, down and distance, injuries, all of that, it can really be a handful for the other offense to have to figure out what do they do well. You have to know who's on the field to decide what the defense is going to do, and anticipating what the defense will do is a big part of play calling as an offense. Granted, would you rather have two bona fide starters and never have to worry about it? Yes, you would rather have that, but you don't have that. So what I think they have here is like, it's not like, well, is it Cam Bynum or Josh Metellus? Well, they're kind of the same players, just one's a little bit better. They're different players. They're different players. And even more so, Scene is a different player than Bynum and Metellus. So I kind of like the whole situation here because I think Flores can work with it. And I think he's up for that challenge of taking inventory of what everyone does and does well and doesn't do well, and then applying that when certain combinations are out on the field. Lastly is, we talked about this a little bit with the linebackers, where it's like you're going to have one look in base and then you may have a sub package where, I mean, that's exactly what's going to go on here. And you may even have three of these guys on the field at once, right? You might have Harrison Smith, Bynum or Metellus, and Scene on the field, depending on the down and distance. So I see a lot of, it's nebulous here. I just see a lot of it's undefined, it's abstract, it's hard to predict. That's what I see happening here in the safety room.
100%. And I think this is maybe another step towards positionless football, in the idea that Lewis Scene is kind of a safety linebacker hybrid when you look at his size. I really think they might use him in that category, because Jordan Hicks is good in some categories, not so great in others. And I think when you think about sub packages, there's a chance that it could be Brian Asamoah and Lewis Scene when it comes to technically the linebacker position. So you can have three safeties and a linebacker in the middle linebacker and safety room. Where I'm really excited to see that type of dynamic going on. Yep,
I agree with you. And this is much different than what we're used to, guys, for the Vikings and the safety position. I cut my teeth with the team. It was Brad Childress and then into Leslie Frazier. And in those defenses, I'll oversimplify it to make the point. I think this is generally correct, though. In those defenses, it was cover two. And the safeties, really, they wanted them to be interchangeable. That's really what it was. And that's not what's happening here right now. And really, for the Vikings, that changed when Harrison Smith came on board. And then Mike Zimmer came on board, and Mike Zimmer got very dynamic with how he used Harrison Smith. And very specific with how he used the complementary safety, Anthony Harris, Andrew Sendejo, whoever it was. They were not interchangeable. They really were not. Might there be a curveball once or twice a game where you'd have Sendejo do something Smith would normally do just to keep the offense on its heels? Yeah, maybe, but they were not interchangeable players. And the safeties under Brian Flores also will not be interchangeable, I don't think. We might hear him say that, oh, we want them to be interchangeable and everyone can do everything, but that's not. If you could go into the laboratory with Mike Flores, that's really not what he's dialing up, right? I mean, he wants a dynamic room. Yeah. So, and I think we're going to have that here. And it's a different look than maybe what we're accustomed to, but that's okay. Yep. And I don't see, we're going to get into the draft and talk draft here in a minute. I really don't see safety being addressed in one of the Vikings first few picks, top 100, top 150. I would be shocked if it was a safety. So I think we got what we got here, right? Mm-hmm. The answer is already on the roster. It's just a matter of, how it's going to get formulated.
Arguably the most set position on the team, to be honest, when you think about all the different areas. So yeah, I agree. I honestly don't see them taking a safety at all in the entire draft. When you look at the age of our current room, outside of Harrison Smith, we're relatively young. And I think we have the good building blocks to go achieve success and have a good safety room.
Yeah. I think before we sort of put a bow on this, let's talk about Flores a little bit more, and maybe Gyles, because you're very bullish on Flores in terms of I haven't heard you talk much about him as a play caller, but more as a developer and a teacher. You're very bullish on him there, which is a good match for the Viking safety room because it's very young. Mm-hmm. With the exception of Harrison Smith. So, how do we think Flores is going to use the safety position? We saw Mike Zimmer be very aggressive with how he used it with Harrison Smith.
Yep.
Brad Childress and Leslie Frazier were not very aggressive with how they use safeties, generally speaking. So, I can't, I've watched so many New England Patriots games throughout the years, but I can't say with any confidence that I know I could characterize how Belichick uses his safeties. I don't know, but however Belichick does it is probably how Flores does it, at least a derivative of that. So I don't know. What's your general idea of how Flores will use safeties? What does he want from the safeties?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to call out, because I was actually just going to mention that after our last conversation. When you think about all the different people we're putting into the room and looking at their strengths and weaknesses, one, we do have one of the best teachers in the NFL, but I think you're absolutely correct. It does rely on play calling to understanding their proficiencies and how to actually apply that on the field in a way that's not predictable, where Lewis's on the field, so they're clearly getting ready for the pass, let's run, right? So being intentionally complex, or at least perceivably complex when it comes to play calling, which is something I definitely trust him to do, because all the players, although they have strengths and weaknesses, aside from Jordan Hicks, are very fast. So I think we're going to leverage the speed to be able to achieve success here. And I think aside from the speed of the safety position, I think it also kind of relies on what we do at the cornerback room, because I think we do need to be able to rely on the cornerback room not to give up coverage, at least in a certain amount of seconds. If we're talking about 2.5 to 3 seconds. Outside of that, he, both in New England and with the Dolphins, was one of the highest blitzers of safeties in the league. When he's with the Dolphins, I believe they had the highest blitz rate for safeties among every other NFL team by a pretty wide margin. So I expect them to blitz quite a lot. I think it also kind of depends on what they do with the edge rusher position. If we keep Zadarius Smith on the roster, because when you make one change, obviously that can affect another. So that might directly impact the number of times we blitz. But I think it's more leading back to the illusion of complexity to say, we're willing to blitz every play. You better be prepared for it. And obviously when you do one thing, that opens up another. So I do expect them to blitz a lot. And if they do back off, it's because they can achieve success somewhere else.
Yeah, it'll be fun to watch. I'll be listening to his media availability, during the spring and training camp, to see if I can read between the lines and pick up on any subtleties. But we're really not going to see it till games. But it's an exciting component of the Vikings season, is the addition of Flores, the changes that will bring, and the personnel usage that will bring with his addition. So excited to see that. And as we transition here to segment 2, of this episode of the Wobcast 2.0 and talk about draft and trying to mock who the Vikings are going to take. I have seen a couple of edge rushers get mocked to the Vikings. I've seen corners get mocked to the Vikings, and I'm sure Brian Flores would be very happy with that. But I think generally speaking, the Vikings are a very difficult team to mock draft for, I think, this year.
Very much so.
Yeah. You know, and the Vikings website, Vikings.com, has a cool weekly content piece where they track mock drafts. I don't know if you're familiar or not with this.
I am, actually.
Okay. I looked at that today in prep for recording the Wobcast. And before we get into talking about how difficult it is to predict who the Vikings will draft, I want to say it's a pretty cool content piece that the Vikings do, because they don't just do it once. They do it every week and it changes. In my day there, we called it mock madness. That's what we called it when I was there. I don't think that's what they call it anymore. At least if they do, I missed that. But, you know, and we developed that content piece because there was a lot of paranoia about members of the, employees of the team predicting who the team was going to take. Like, we just, as an organization, we weren't comfortable with sending me out there and predicting who the Vikings were going to take. So our get around for that was, all right, well, we won't predict it, but we'll share with you in one place who everyone else is predicting, and track that and then analyze that. And that's how we came up with it. And we called it mock madness because we started doing this right in the middle of March when the NCAA basketball tournament was going on, and March Madness, and we called it mock madness. So pleased to see that they're still doing something similar to that on Vikings.com. Well after my time there, they're holding on to that content piece, and I remember it being very, very successful. And we would always try and find like twists, like different things to do. So one year at the Combine, we had, Mike Mayock and Bucky Brooks and everyone say, with the 8th pick in the 2011 NFL draft, the Minnesota Vikings select, and then have them say it. So we would record that at the Combine because everyone was there, but we would save it for draft week and then, and then create a video and send that video out on draft week. And the last one in the compilation was Rick Spielman. And we'd spoof it. So he'd say, like, he'd be just about to say the name and then we'd cut out, yeah. So it was a cool content piece, but
I love that.
Yeah. Anyway, there's just no consensus on it right now for the Vikings at 23. I mean, there's not offense, defense consensus. There's not positional consensus. There's not name consensus. There's not even consensus on if it'll be a quarterback or not. I mean, you've got guys who are of equal stature in NFL circles, one saying it's time for them to take a quarterback and the other one saying there's no chance they're taking a quarterback. And one of them's dead wrong, so
it has to be.
Yeah. So, just very interesting to take a look at them. I don't think you can glean anything from the mock drafts for the Vikings because some are trading up, some are trading down. There's just no way really to mock it. I don't know if you've got a strong opinion on it at all, or if there's any you've paid attention to throughout the years that have been pretty dead on, but I think it's very hard to wrangle right now.
I might be proven way off, and this is far more feeling based than it maybe should be. I try to be a pretty logical person, but every day we get closer to the NFL draft, which we're 23 days out currently, I think they're going to trade up. I really do. I think there's been projections that the Arizona Cardinals at spot 3 are shopping their pick. Wow. So the 3rd pick. So that means, I mean, if you're being somewhat logical about this, that's either Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, or Anthony Richardson. If one of those gets picked number 1, like if Anthony Richardson goes number 1, you're either getting Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, which I am absolutely okay with. If you have to give up 2 first-round picks and a player, I am doing that 10 times out of 10. Not because I'm that in hate with Kirk Cousins, but I think if you're looking at the long-term stability of the quarterback position for the Minnesota Vikings, one of those 3 guys at least 2 out of the 3 are absolutely worth taking in the top 3 and trading up to go get it. I think Anthony Richardson is a little bit of a question mark, but based on the sheer upside and the competency in the quarterback room for the Minnesota Vikings, when you think about Kevin O'Connell, I think we can do something with that. Sure. It's just a matter of whether they sit behind Kirk for a year or if you try to find a trade partner.
Yeah.
I really see them trading up to number 3. I don't know. It's partially feeling based, I know, but I really am getting a stronger feeling that they're going to trade up.
Wow. How exciting would that be? And that would probably, I don't know, when would that happen? You think that happened when they're on the clock, or you think that happens a day before? A week before?
That's an interesting thing. I've heard a few different personalities in the Minnesota sports scene talk about Dalvin Cook and the fact that he hasn't been traded. And a lot of them are speculating that they're waiting for the day of to be able to see how the board falls and then use him as ammunition plus something else to go move up or move down, but like use him as a pre-negotiated trade. And there's a chance that, let's say they don't like Anthony Richardson. Let's just speculate on that. And they want CJ Stroud or Bryce Young. If Anthony Richardson is picked number 1 overall, then you execute the trade saying, I want either Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. Because then you know one of the two will be on the board at 3. And then you pull the trade versus if you don't like Anthony Richardson, then maybe you wait on the number 3 position because you are going to have to compete with other teams to go up to number 3. It's just a matter of fact. So I think it kind of depends on how the board falls and what they truly want at the quarterback position.
Wow. And again, this ties back to last week's episode where we talked about the unavoidable adverse effect it will have on the team and the offense and the coach quarterback relationship if you take a quarterback this year in the draft in the first 60 picks. And you can preempt it by telling Cousins you're going to do it, by reassuring him that he's the guy. You won't have to look over your shoulder. He's not starting this year. You can do all that, but it's still going to hurt your relationship with Cousins if you take it, because he knows he's out after the season, at a minimum after the season, if not before that. And you just can't help but to have one foot out the door when that happens to you.
Thankfully,
However,
he'll still have the incentive to be successful.
Yes, and he will, because he'll want a new deal with a new team next year, right? I don't think you'll get a precipitous drop in performance from Cousins, but I think you're just going to be missing something. And what that is something you had in spades last year. You just kind of had that mojo last year, right? You had the Kirk chains and the miracle plays and the close finishes, and just you had just all of it was just working for you. That just takes a huge hit if you take a quarterback. However, it might be the best move for the long interest of the team, which is part of what you have to look out for. It is mostly what you have to look out for, really. So So
especially if you plan on moving off of Kirk Cousins in the next 4 years. Let's say we don't see a future beyond 4 years with Kirk Cousins. Eventually, you're going to have to take one. And I think it's important to note that both TJ Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson are going to have huge contracts coming up. And if you want to maximize those contracts and being able to actually achieve something of value with their performance on the field, you need to make sure you have a competent quarterback both today and tomorrow. So I think it's important to keep that long-term in mind versus going into the quarterback position with a question mark. You could waste the talent that is Justin Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beyond Kirk Cousins.
I totally agree with that. I mean, this is a quarterback and coach league, so you got to have those two things right. But with that being said, with where the Vikings are from a roster and a salary cap standpoint and the way this thing is structured and on-field performance, I mean, they will start and stop as Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson's production starts and stops. I mean, that's what this team is about, right? Those are your cornerstone players right now, along with Cousins for now. It's not Dalvin Cook. It's not Danielle Hunter or Harrison Smith or Byron Murphy Jr. As good as those players are, the Vikings start and stop with their production at those two spots, Jefferson and Hawkinson. So almost everything you do needs to be about building that up. So,
and ensuring that you have long-term success both on the field and off the field. I think it's also important to make sure that they stay happy so they don't want off the team and go somewhere else.
Yep, exactly right. Yep. All right. Safeties, draft, anything else we need to hit on here before we wrap it up?
No, I'm really excited for this safety position. I truly think if you put Josh Metellus on the field and Harrison Smith can get back to form under Brian Flores, I do expect us to have a top 10 safety room. Now, I know a lot of people will call me crazy and that's way too overly optimistic. But when you look at their production, I don't think that is out of the realm of possibility. Both of them have the upside to be able to make that happen with the right instruction.
Yep. And Harrison Smith ascended to his status in the league by way of becoming being a first round pick. I think he was 29th overall. Mm-hmm. But not every star travels that path. Sometimes really good players, star players, you get them the way you got Josh Metellus. Mm-hmm. That does happen. And so even though you may not be a PFF believer and you might not have seen enough of Josh Metellus to believe in him the way we're suggesting it could unfold, that you got to be open to it. You got to be open-minded to it. And we talk about this all the time too. There are spots on your roster where you got to get by. You can't have a blue chip free agent signing at every position. You can't have a second round pick at every position. You got to get by with some guys. And I think the Vikings stand a very good chance to do more than just get by with Josh Metellus. I think they have a chance to have a really good thing going with Josh Metellus and Harrison Smith this year, and then Lewis Seen and Josh Metellus next year. So, and either way it shakes out. Maybe Brian Flores just really takes a liking to Cam Bynum and Metellus is kind of your primary backup. I think you're in a good position there too with Metellus,
agreed.
So
very durable player.
Yeah. So, alrighty. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Wobcast 2.0. We thank you for joining. We encourage you to check out past episodes and future episodes. To do that, you can subscribe to the Wobcast 2.0, the same place you subscribe and see all of your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're also on YouTube. Check us out there. You can find me on Twitter at Wobby. For Chase and for Gyles, this is Wobby signing off for now. Back next week to talk more Vikings defense as we touch on the cornerbacks and talk even more NFL draft.